Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another Parliamentary and Scientific Committee discussion meeting. The number of people dropping in has now stopped, so we will get underway. It's brilliant to welcome you all again to what I hope is going to be a really interesting discussion on genome editing and farmed animal breeding and the social and ethical issues therein. And this has been organised in conjunction with the Nuffield Foundation on Bioethics. So we are very grateful to them. To help explore this, we have three excellent speakers, Dr. Elizabeth Crisp, Professor John Dupree, and Darren Bhattacharya, who I'm going to allow to introduce themselves when we get to that part of the meeting. Each of them will have 10 minutes to put across their points, and then we will come to a Q&A session. And for those of you who have been involved in a PNSC meeting before, you will know that rather than using the chat or the raising of the hand, please use the question and answer function. It helps us keep all the questions in one place and helps Lee to corral them into some semblance of an order that he can then send to me. Once I've got them and we've finished the presentations, I will go through the list and I will invite each of you to ask your question in person, and so you will be unmuted. Can I just remind you, of course, that when you do ask your question that you state obviously your name, but the organisation that you are representing. Now, just before I get on to our three speakers, I have some news to share with you. Over the weekend, I had a discussion with our president, Lord Brewers, Alec Brewers, who has decided that he is going to retire from Parliament at the end of the year, which means that we will lose our president, and this is will be a sad loss for us. Alec has been a fantastic champion of science and technology across the House, and particularly in support of this committee. And so I'm sure I and many others will miss him and his sage-like advice. So I just want to place on record my gratitude for all that he has done for the Parliamentary and Scientific Committee. I'm sure that we will have some sort of formal goodbye, either through an article in our quarterly magazine, Science in Parliament, and although he is retiring from Parliament, he will still have access as a retired member, and so I'm sure we will see him from time to time, and he may well continue to drop into our meetings, but he wants to spend more time with his family, many of whom are based in America, and so I do understand his reasoning, and so their gain will be our sad loss. So as I say, I want to thank him, Alec, for everything he has done for us. So we will move on to our first speaker, who is Dr. Elizabeth Crisp. Elizabeth, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'll allow you to do your own formal introduction so that I normally get these wrong about who's from which department, etc. So please take a few seconds to make sure we get that right, and then please share your thoughts with us for up to 10 minutes.
Well, I will with pleasure, but I think, John, were you not going first, John, to introduce the Nuffield report?
I was expecting to, though I'm always happy to defer.
No, that's fine. My list is slightly different, so apologies, Elizabeth, but John, same thing applies. Please introduce yourself and 10 minutes, please.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. This is not the... Yes. Okay. So I think there should have been an earlier slide, but yes. Right. So, so you've heard what this is about. I'm sure you know you wouldn't be here. I'm John Dupree. In my day job, I'm Professor of Philosophy of Science at the University of Exeter, but I'm here in the capacity written under here, Chair of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics Working Group on Genome Editing and Farm Animal Breeding. Okay, so for those of you who don't know what the Nuffield Council on Bioethics is, it's an independent organization that was established in the UK in 1991. And it has a very specific role to inform policy and public debate about ethical questions raised by biological and medical research, and particularly, kind of state-of-the-art, cutting-edge research. So as it's emerging techniques or knowledge, what the ethical implications of that are. It's funded and has been since, I think, 1994 by the Medical Research Council, the Nuffield Foundation, of course, and the Wellcome Trust. Okay, so the one, I guess, maybe obvious from its mission why this is a topic that came up, but there's a little history. A few years ago, the Nuffield produced a report on genome editing in general and the distinctive ethical issues that it raised. One of the outcomes of that report was identifying particular areas that needed detailed treatment. One of these, perhaps unsurprisingly, was genome editing of the human germline, let's say human reproductive cells. A report on this came out a couple of years ago, but the other was a less obvious one, and this is the present topic, was the question of editing of farm animals. And particular reasons why this was an important topic was that it's an area where actual applications are quite close to being ready to roll out. And this has been quite little discussed. In fact, we think that there might well be genome edited meat on shop floors in perhaps 5 to 10 years. And so it's quite pressing that we should look at this point at the ethical issues raised. The Nuffield, this is a full scale report by the Nuffield. This is quite a major undertaking. It involves a multidisciplinary working group with expertise. You see food farming systems, animal biotech, biological research, veterinary medicine, law, philosophy, and specifically within philosophy ethics. The group that we assembled with this expertise met, I believe, 16 times, either in person or online. And we also gathered evidence both from an open call, from experts that we consulted. We commissioned research on particular topics. So we interviewed a number of people, and more recently, we conducted a public dialogue. So it's a pretty extensive bit of work. As the core of this, we identified as we wanted to look very broadly at the kind of situation of food and farming systems and the way that those might feed in, that this technology might feed into them. And we immediately, the first thing we did was identify some really major challenges that these systems face at the moment. And we grouped these under these categories. Starting with animal health. Of course, that includes diseases, but we also wanted to focus on welfare much more broadly. So this would include a general presupposition that we made, or assumption that we at least came to and defended, that we should have farming systems in which animals were able to live some kind of quality of life, that a life at least worth living for the time that they lived it. And so we were looking at the conditions in which animals lived, and we looked at things like the mutilations that often animals undergo, for example, castration of animals, dehorning of cows, which is a very painful activity, the removal of pigs' tails or chickens' beaks, and the ways that these were necessitated by the kind of farming systems that we had. As a kind of paradigm, we looked with considerable discomfort at the state of the current broiler chicken, which over the last 50 years has quadrupled in size. It takes less time to reach this terminal size, and as a consequence, its legs often won't support it. It typically has sores where it's forced to sit for long periods in its waist and so on. And we thought this was a pretty unsatisfactory state of things. Human health is, of course, connected. There are zoonotic diseases. We hardly need to tell anybody at this point in time. There are non-infectious diseases from diet. Meat is obviously implicated in this. And there's a problem of antimicrobial resistance, which is connected to the way antimicrobials are used in animals. There are questions of food supply, food security, the international availability, the international trade dependence of food supplies, and the growing demand for meat in the developing world, which is obviously putting additional strains on the system. And we also wanted to look at the social and cultural issues, the impact of changes in farming history, which of course has a very long history, and the various determinants of diet, social, cultural, religious, moral, and so on. So, and finally, of course, there are many environmental implications of farming systems. There's greenhouse gas production, famously from cows. There is questions of water supply, most of which goes into food production. There's deforestation, which is often a consequence of growing food for feed crops for animals, and questions of biodiversity. So a number of major challenges. And so having identified these, we were of course interested in the potential of genome editing to alleviate or address some of these problems. And I think we were very clear that there were areas where this could happen. For example, directly at the problem of disease, there is currently being tested at the Roslin Institute a genetic modification of pigs that makes them largely resistant to one of the worst diseases that pigs suffer from, porcine reproductive and respiratory syndrome. So this clear has potential benefits for welfare and sustainability. But a theme that ran through our work was a concern that we did not want to endorse the use of this technology, or indeed any biotechnology, as we didn't want to limit it to the particular one we were looking at now, to essentially setting in place or keeping in place indefensible forms of farming systems. So we imagine that it's perfectly possible that producing disease-resistant pigs would just mean more and more pigs could be crammed into even smaller spaces in less hygienic conditions with less chance of producing an adequate level of welfare. So this was something that ran through all of our thinking. Was there were definite potential benefits, but we needed to be aware of the kind of system that we were feeding these benefits into, as to whether in the long run they were really addressing our central concern, which is was that we should put the welfare of animals in a central place in our thinking on all of this. So what did we find? Well, as I've just alluded to in very general terms, but perhaps now I put in more bluntly, we concluded that the food and farming systems that currently exist are morally indefensible and unsustainable. And we need to make major changes in the ways we produce and consume food. We think that new biotechnologies could play a really important role in this, but we need really good governance in place to achieve this. We did not think it was a good idea just to open up the market to these technologies and see what happens, because what has happened, what exists and what has happened in the past is in many ways very undesirable. So we reached the general view that we needed to take a very deep look at what kind of food and farming system we wanted before we were able to see how these technologies might ultimately contribute to producing these kinds of outcomes. And this led us to a number of recommendations to, obviously to the UK government, also to animal breeders, food retailers, research funders, and other stakeholders in the food and farming industry, in the UK firstly, but also internationally. And here, finally, we made a number of central recommendations. And as I've already made clear, we strongly recommended a policy review of the regulatory regime for genetically modified organisms, but that must be placed in the context of articulating a vision for the future of the food and farming system. And to achieve this, we strongly recommend the necessity of public dialogue to understand the position of the population at this time on these questions. We suggested that in order to achieve the kind of benefits for animal welfare, or the tolerable level of animal welfare that we advocate, we should do a couple of things. One was to put a traffic light system in where we would look at the state of certain animals. For example, we think broiler chickens and say, this really deserves a red light, which means we should not be doing, we should essentially discontinue in the most expedient way we can, the use of this kind of animal, and which of course means we shouldn't be finding new ways to improve their breeding. We also, and of course, amber light with problems, green light where we think the species or breed is basically all right, and we can look at ways of perhaps improving it. We also thought we should we should encourage the introduction of breeding values used to inform genetic research that included a much wider range of factors, such as the environmental and welfare-related matters that we were discussing. Finally, we suggested that it might be possible for the government to sponsor an agreement among retailers to provide pathways for ensuring that animal products on sale were produced in a responsibly bred way with animals which met these basic welfare conditions. And I'm sorry, I've gone a couple of minutes too long, but that's enough for me. And I guess
John, thank you very much indeed for that. Very interesting. Just for those who are not particularly experts in this area, my understanding is there is a difference between GMOs and organisms that have been genetically edited. One can be achieved through natural breeding programs, but we have a scientific technique to speed that up. And the other is where you introduce potentially bits of or genes that would not occur naturally. And can you just sort of clarify what the exact landscape is for us?
Yeah, this is quite complicated landscape, I have to say, but I'll try and make some sense of it. So genome editing is a much more precise, targeted way of making changes in the genome. The old-fashioned genetically modified organisms were really just, putting very crudely, were just shot bits of genetic material into the cell and hope they stick somewhere. And often, typically, these bits of genetic material were taken from some other organism so that there wasn't a pathway by which they could have come into the organism. In the case of genome editing, as is a totally different set of techniques used to make changes in the organism. Most often, those certainly are making changes to a condition that does exist somewhere in nature. Though this is, I don't think we want to make too much of this distinction because, for example, the how closely related does the pig gene that I mentioned occurs naturally in a wild pig that could, in principle, probably be mated with a domestic pig, but wouldn't normally do so. So I think that difference is perhaps a little difficult to make full sense of, but it is the really important thing is it's a much more precise, targeted and technique. And certainly one could restrict it in ways one wanted to particular sources of the genetic information.
Brilliant. Thank you. We may well come back to that, but thank you very much for that very comprehensive and informative introduction. Right, we will move on now to our second speaker, which I believe is going to be Dr. Elizabeth Cripps. Elizabeth, if we could have 10, 12 minutes from you. I'm not going to be that strict on time, seeing as we have got 3 speakers as opposed to our usual 4. It will still leave us plenty of time for questions. So, Elizabeth, over to you.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much for inviting me here. So I'm talking from a very cold Edinburgh tonight, where I'm a senior lecturer in political theory, but what I do is climate justice. So I'm a philosopher, moral and political philosopher who focuses on climate justice. And so I was invited to be part of this working group that John has chaired. We've been working together with a very diverse group over the last couple of years on this project, and what I'm going to talk about today is to go into a little bit more detail on what we mean when we're talking about justice in food and farming systems and this broader context that John alluded to. So what we came down to is, as a starting point, is the idea that basic justice, whatever else it requires, means that we design institutions so that they protect people's basic interests. They enable people to lead good lives. And that's something that we can talk about when we're talking about basic justice within a state. It's also potentially some language we can use for global justice, and also, of course, and this is very important in this context, intergenerational justice. So the idea is that it's important morally that we can satisfy our physical needs for getting health, food, shelter, all those sort of basic needs, but also that we have the ability to lead a good life in the sense of being able to exercise those other capacities which are key to being human. So, for example, the ability to form social bonds, to have relationships of affiliation with other people. And so, broadly speaking, we can say that the state's job, one of the state's jobs, is to make sure that all the people in society, all the members of society, are able to live a good life in that minimal sense. So an example, of course, would be food security. A just food and farming system would have to make sure that all those who were affected by it were able to get safe, nutritious food. And because, of course, we are also aware that future generations have basic interests that matter too, that has to be done sustainably. But the other thing that we came down on very clearly, I think, from a moral point of view when we were putting the report together, was that non-human animals, including the non-human animals who are most impacted by the food and farming industry, so the animals we eat or whose milk or eggs we eat, they also have morally relevant basic interests, and these matter too. And these animals are caught up in our institutions. They are dependent for everything on our food and farming systems. So they depend on us for the conditions that mean that they can lead or not lead good lives. And it's very clear from the philosophical literature we looked at, and these moral philosophers are also working on material from scientists who are looking at animal experience, animal cognition in detail. It seemed very clear that animals are like us in some morally significant ways. So obviously cows and pigs and sheep and other animals can suffer, they can feel pain, and so that matters morally. But it's also about more than that. It's about the fact that animals can lead good lives in a much more sophisticated way than that. They can have positive experiences, emotional experiences. There are things that they need to be able to lead a good life. So, for example, for some animals that would involve having the space to roam freely. So animals matter morally. That's very much where the sort of philosophical debate is now, drawing, as I say, on a lot of science about animal experiences. They matter morally, and it's about more than just the ability to feel pain, although that is important too. So from that, what would a just food and farming system look like? Well, it would need to be organised and governed in a way that would respect and protect those basic interests of those who were affected by it. And that obviously is people, so the people who eat the food, the people who produce the food, very importantly as well, and also indirectly, because I mean, we'll come back to environmental impacts in a moment. There are ways in which our food and farming systems in one country will indirectly impact people elsewhere. But also, crucially, the animals, the farm animals, their interests also matter in determining whether these systems can be considered just. So broadly speaking, we're saying, well, as a baseline, we need food and farming systems which enable the humans and animals affected by them to live their lives reasonably well. So to have the sort of basic needs, but also to have some experiences which mean that they can lead a good life for the kind of animal that they are. But then, and John has already talked about this a bit, we know that the food and farming system faces and contributes to a number of huge global and societal challenges which can really impact basic justice. So there's the challenges for animal health and animal welfare. And actually, I mean, so this report is focused on one particular breeding biotechnology, but breeding measures in the past, as John has said, have led to some negative impacts on animal welfare. So an example would be if hens are bred to produce lots more eggs, that can end up giving them problems with osteoporosis and ultimately leading to things like bone fractures. There are human health challenges, those associated with high meat diets, also associated with zoonotic diseases. So farm animals can be essentially a transmitter for diseases between wild animals and humans. They can also potentially incubate these diseases. And because farming contributes to deforestation, and deforestation is linked with the rise in zoonotic diseases, that's another way in which human health is affected. And then, of course, there is the way in which the practice of giving preventative antibiotics to farm animals is exacerbating the crisis, and I think it really is a crisis, of antibiotic resistance. We then have the social, cultural, political challenges, the challenges around demand and supply that John alluded to. So we have growing demand for meat, particularly in low-income countries. We also have challenges around supply, like it's rare for a country to be able to supply its own food. We in the UK import quite a bit of meat, as I'm sure most of you know better than me. And then there are the environmental challenges that we face. So climate change associated, of course, with methane emissions, but also crucially with the way in which protein is fed to animals, thereby feeding us much more inefficiently than it would be if we ate the soya ourselves. There are the challenges around animal waste, which can lead to problems with pollution and disease. There is water scarcity. So I think it's 70% of the world's fresh water is used for agriculture, and 20% of that is for livestock. There is deforestation, so 73% of deforestation in tropical and subtropical areas is driven by agriculture, and there is biodiversity loss. So we have these huge challenges that both cause problems for the food and farming industry and are exacerbated by it. So there are ways in which the food and farming industry can make injustice worse, but also ways in which this is an industry which is absolutely integral to securing basic justice. So the background against which we came to this report is essentially that we have an industry, a huge system at a crossroads. So we absolutely have to find a way of adapting to produce and consume food in a way which is just and sustainable, a way that is able to address these challenges. We need to, as a society, the industry need to, and decision makers, like many of you, will be needing to face these challenges. So that's, even though we started off the report thinking we were focusing on this relatively narrow question of genome editing, it quickly became apparent to us that we had to see the implications of this new technology and any other potential new breeding biotechnologies in this much broader context. So we have to see it against the background of an industry which really does need to adapt to become ethical and sustainable. So one of the conclusions that we drew, for example, was to call for government funding to explore different food types, to encourage shifts towards more sustainable diets, for example. And so it was against this background that we come back to this question of genome editing and biotechnology. And we see that it has the potential essentially to go either way. We can't draw a clear line and say this technology is good or bad, because it is a tool which has the potential to help with these challenges. So there's the example of disease resistance. So just down the road from me now at Roslin, they have used genome editing to develop pigs who are immune to porcine reproductive and respiratory syndrome, and that can have huge positive impacts both for animal welfare but also potentially for alleviating the need to give antibiotics to farm animals if we can develop disease resistance. So there are some huge transformative potentials from these technology, but we also are very concerned that it's approached cautiously, so that this technology is used in a way that will actually further the move towards the just and sustainable food and farming systems that we all need, rather than in further entrenching potentially undesirable or unsustainable systems. So John used the example of if disease resistance meant that animals were farmed much more intensively, that would be an example in terms of animal welfare. But we can also make the point more broadly. If this sort of shifts us towards intensive systems which could be more environmentally problematic, then that would not be the right outcome from a justice point of view from these technologies. So essentially, we ended up going extensively into this much broader question of these huge challenges faced by this system, to the conclusion that these new technologies, they're here, they're going to be coming into the system. It's absolutely crucial that the government introduces them in a way which is absolutely focused on securing and promoting basic interests, human and animals, that this makes the system more just rather than less just. So I'll leave you with that. I've forgotten to keep an eye on my time, so I hope I didn't go over too long. Thank you.
No, that's perfect, Elizabeth. Thank you very much indeed. Your last point there about the role of government, but presumably it's not just national governance, it needs to be done on a global basis. Can you just, you may have covered it and I might have missed it, what is the global mechanism for trying to regulate this technology? Because my understanding is there are some countries who are just completely opposed to it, full stop, and there are others who would like to race ahead and use it more widely.
Well, I'm slightly going to cheat by deferring the question to John, who I think will be able to give a more detailed answer. But what I would say is, I mean, our report is we're primarily making our recommendations to the UK government and the UK industry. So one of the things we call for is international solidarity and cooperation in recognition of the fact that, as you say, this is an irreducibly global challenge. But I think, John, you might well have something to add on that.
Not a whole lot, because we didn't look in great detail at this, certainly, and we were mainly focusing on the application in the UK. I suppose one fairly clear point is that if we were to go down the kind of path that we're strongly advocating, we would need to have controls on the availability of food that required imported food to apply similar standards to those that we advocating for our own producers, for very obvious reasons, I'm sure, to people here. So I think that's I think we didn't look beyond that fairly obvious market requirement.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, we will move on to our third speaker. But just before that, I do that, can I just remind people that if they have a question, to use the Q&A function, type in a brief outline and just say question, please, and then Lee will let me know who's interested in asking a question. Right, let's move on to our third and final speaker, which is Darren Bhattacharya. Darren, we look forward to hearing what you have to say. 10, 12 minutes, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. And good evening, everyone. So I'm Darren Bhattacharya. I work for a company called Basis Social. So we're an independent research firm, and we undertook the public dialogue on the behalf of Nuffield Council on bioethics. Before we get into the findings of the dialogue, I just wanted to touch on some of the factors that shape policy and public debate in this area. So, as I'm sure you're all very keenly aware, the potential use of agricultural biotech in the UK has had a long and often acrimonious history, not least the GM crop and food controversies in the late 1990s and early 2000s. I'm not going to rake over those particular coals this evening, other to flag a kind of key learning from social scientists who are working on this area at the time. And that's that risk-based regulatory scientific assessments of GMOs on human health often miss a kind of broader set of social considerations beyond harm. And those were things like the purpose of the technology, who benefits from it, and the wider social and ethical implications for food and farming systems. So I want to hold that for, because it's very pertinent to some of the points I make shortly. So this broad kind of controversy and context foreshadowed the public consultation that was launched earlier this year in January on the regulation of genetic technologies. And as Stephen mentioned, a key focus of this consultation was whether the regulations around genome editing for farming should diverge from European legislation, which has treated the technology like GMOs, and specifically whether technologies where genetic changes which could have been introduced by traditional breeding methods should be excluded from such regulations. What I will highlight in the next 10 minutes or so is, as important as these issues are, there is a risk that by narrowing and focusing the debate on such a kind of set of technical concerns, that we may miss these wider considerations about how such technologies may be used and governed. So the public dialogue. What do we do? So a public dialogue, for those who aren't involved, is basically when we convene members of the public, just a good cross-section of the public, in discussions around various topics, in this case, genome editing in farmed animals. We undertook a kind of 5-stage approach. The first, we did an REA, rapid evidence assessment, and we conducted a number of stakeholder interviews, about 11 in total. And the purpose of doing this was threefold. The first was to know what public engagement had been undertaken in this area. The second was to identify some material and content that we could use as part of the dialogue process. And the third was to identify stakeholders and experts who could contribute to the dialogue in response to public requests. The debates themselves took place over 3 evenings on Zoom. The first workshop really looked to enable people to explore their relationships to food and farming, and in this context, introduce genome editing. Between workshops, we then ran some sessions where we explored some of those issues in a little bit more depth, and people came up with a bunch of questions that they'd quite like answered. So workshop 2 was a kind of question time format. We had a couple of expert panels, and members of the public were invited to put some of those questions to those panels and then debate with them. And then they were asked to reflect on that between workshops 2 and 3. On workshop 3, they talked about the reflections, but then we specifically got into some of the applications of those areas of genome editing farmed animals and some of the ethical implications. And then we wrote it all up. So I would encourage you to read the report. It's a marvelous report. I'll just touch on a few of the findings here. So there were kind of 4 domains around genome editing in farmed animals that were really pertinent to members of the public. The first was food systems, and as was hinted at by other speakers, the type of farming that we want to develop. The second was farmed animals, particularly issues concerning their welfare. The third was humans and how we feed ourselves safely. And the fourth was nature and the natural order. And this both was things around ideas of what naturalness and what naturalness is, through to things like playing God. People did want to influence the way in which the meat that they consumed is reared. And their questions under some of these topics were things like, in farmed animals, will enable more animals to live outside and live a more natural life, however that's defined. In terms of food systems, it was things like, who does this really benefit? Is it farmers, local farmers, or is it larger corporations and globalized markets? In terms of impact on humans, it was things like, do we know what the long-term health and social implications of this are? And so on and so forth. And in terms of nature and naturalness, there was a sense about where are the boundaries around this? Where does it stop? So when these issues were discussed, they were discussed in terms of consequences, duties, and virtues. So consequences was kind of weighing up the benefits or harm that could come through genome editing. Duties included both duties to other human beings and how we get safe and affordable food for all, including people globally, but also duties to other animals and how we ensure they have a good life. And then virtues more related to the moral character of our collective decisions. So rather than me tell you what people said, I thought we could potentially hear from them. So I'm going to play a short clip, which is my colleague Dan chatting to some of the folks that took part.
It's like if you're saying diseases, say you can protect the animals against diseases, that's fine if they were in a good environment. Say they were like your pets and you're protecting against disease, but you've got the other side where are you protecting against disease so they can't fall ill with things, so we can keep them in worse conditions because they're not going to catch anything anyway, but also then that is producing meat or milk for people and people are consuming it, then what's that down the line? What's the problems that are going to come out of that? Because these animals are more resistant to things. So if people are going to become more resistant to things and then have a knock-on effect that other illnesses can get worse, or they're not going to be able to react against, if you get ill, you're not going to react against a medication like antibiotics that you need to take. You may become more immune to things, but also resistant to drugs that are going to help you. Or can it also cause more cancers?
Well, if there is a, let's say, X disease that there is no other way of,
so say avian flu, which is a good example.
Avian flu, for example, there is no way of dealing with that, and that leads to the animals being inside and all the repercussions it has. If gene editing then can fix the situation, then it will have more of a yes from my part, for example. It's like, in paper sounds amazing, but it's just, I don't see it actually happening.
And also with the horns as well. If it does reduce the horn length to stop gouging of other animals, maybe it's sort of the kind of tinkering we do with genetics is probably going to be looking at guidelines of where we find it's acceptable for things like that, where it is going to be purely the morphological aspects of an animal and maybe its illnesses that we're going to see be viewed as more acceptable than those that we don't. I don't know what the ones are that we don't yet, because that's going to be the next question, isn't it, Dan?
Okay, so you heard from some of the wonderful members of the public. And I guess in this context, this is where certain applications of genome editing in farmed animals were seen on a kind of continuum of acceptability. I mean, overall, people wanted to move away from intensive farming systems towards a more healthy, affordable, sustainable food production system, and not at the extent, at the expense of animal welfare. So we looked at a whole range of applications. Here are 4 here. On the kind of far left, the least acceptable was things like docile animals. So could you breed animals that were less frightened on the route to slaughter? People just felt that was morally indefensible to do that. Through to animals where you might get less allergenicity responses in humans, was slightly more acceptable. But again, there were a range of concerns about this, both in terms of wider human health impacts, but also that kind of instrumental use of animals purely for that purpose. Affordable meat came up quite a lot. It was a very contentious issue. There was a wider sense of people needing to eat less meat because that was part of the issue, but making healthy food more affordable was obviously a key need for people, and was something that in certain application areas was seen as a possible area. And then the most supported applications were those that promoted animal welfare. I'm happy to touch on some more of these later if that's helpful. So I just wanted to pull out some kind of policy insights and applications. The public framing of genome editing of farmed animals wasn't about foreign DNA, about transgenic material. And I do think that there is a risk if we frame the debate on such concerns, it kind of misses the point. What people want is a better food and farming system, not a debate on whether it contains a foreign piece of DNA in an animal now. People do want a healthy, affordable, sustainable food and farming system. So the key question for genome editing is, how does it support this purpose, and what would the benefits be? In this context, and this has been hinted at earlier, welfare standards in intensive farming systems is a concern. Selective breeding was very much seen part of that wider system. So in and of itself, an extension of selective breeding practice does not provide an ethical basis for the use of genome editing in farmed animals. As I've mentioned, increasing the welfare of animals is the most acceptable applications. So what might this mean for kind of governance and regulation? What would a governance system which placed animal welfare much more front and center actually look like? It would look quite different in my personal view. The one other big thing was this was seen as a really powerful and invasive technology. So people did want to know what the alternatives were. And those other technology trajectories should be looked at alongside genome editing and not just kind of looking at each one in turn. I think finally, I just wanted to highlight that about the role of future dialogue in policy development. I think what this has shown is that people have a keen interest in food and farming and the values that underpin it, that they want to change rather than perpetuate an unsustainable food system. And that while things like safety is important, it's only part of a much deeper discussion that people are able and willing to contribute to. The National Food Strategy recently highlighted that the food system we have is both a miracle and a disaster. And I think there is an opportunity at the moment to change the dynamic around food, to reflect that wider public interest, and to govern in a way that creates a system that society more generally wants to see. Thank you.
Darren, thank you very much indeed. Very interesting. I remember those discussions around the late 90s and how a fairly complex issue got simplified by sensational media. How will you avoid that happening as this discussion continues? You're debating it with the public and getting good feedback. What you don't want is for someone to oversimplify the very complex areas you're discussing.
I think by listening more, by engaging I mean, as well, rather than just dismiss some of those earlier debates, I think we need to be attentive to why people reacted in that way. For me, GMOs was a lightning rod for lots of other things going on, into which if regulators and government and others, at least engaged and listened to some of those, and then talked about the technology in that broader context, we might move forward in a slightly more productive way. But yeah, I mean, I was also involved in a lot of those debates, and they were, not the most edifying.
No, quite. Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you to all three of my speakers. So we will now go to questions, and my first question is from Lord Stansgate. Stephen.
Thank you very much for very interesting presentations. Can I ask what the relationship is between the definitions of a healthy, happy life for animals and the decision that this government has taken and is putting into legislation, that there is a greater degree of animal sentience than was previously thought to be the case? Has this informed the discussions you've had so far?
Would like to take that.
I'm happy to have a go, and I think John might well want to say something as well. I mean, so as I mentioned, so the sort of the debate that we were thinking about, that we were drawing on, the sort of debate around animal ethics, is very informed by the science on animal cognition and animal sentience. So yes, this is very much part and parcel of the same recognition that actually animals are much more capable of quite complex and sophisticated lives than they have been given credit for, but that's something that needs to be incorporated into the way that we evaluate, the way that we treat them very broadly, and of course that includes the food and farming systems. John, did you want to add anything to that?
Not. I mean, really, I just agree totally with what you said. I mean, that, you know, in philosophy, there is a long tradition of, generally traced back to René Descartes, of thinking of animals as basically machines lacking the bits of us that make us aware, conscious of the world and feeling things. And I think that has been universally rejected by almost all philosophers over the last, perhaps, century, half century, and I think it's taken as pretty well established that animals are we are animals, and we are like other animals, broadly speaking, in having conscious experience. Though obviously, there's a lot of debate about how exactly our experiences might be more complex and sophisticated in certain ways than any other animals. But I think it's a pretty clearly accepted that animals have varyingly complex inner lives that we should take account of.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Right, my second question is from someone who is an anonymous. If you did stick a question into the Q&A section, can you raise your hand now? And if that's possible, or is it our telephone caller? There's one person on a telephone. I wonder if that's who it was. Perhaps, Ben, we can unmute the person who's called in. Hello? Okay, maybe not. In which case, I will go to Theodora House-Keller. Theodora.
I'm not sure they are on the call, Stephen.
Oh, have they gone? No, I can see them there. Two up from the bottom, Ben.
Sorry, that's my mistake.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
I was muted. I couldn't do anything. So I listened to John's presentation, and I don't know how to make sense of that. Why do we have very different welfare rules regarding the pets, the animal we have next to us, and the farming animals. I mean, the mutilation of a chicken or pig, we cannot do that to a dog without being in serious trouble. So why do we still operate with this two different sets of rules?
Hi, Tia. Is that, I mean, we can cut the tails off dogs in some circumstances, I believe, can we not? So I'm not, I mean, we didn't really, I mean, we didn't look at all in this inquiry at sort of companion animals. And certainly I take it we would have wanted to apply, broadly speaking, the same principles. I guess I mean, we did also recognize, we didn't, most people think it's a terrible thing to eat your pet. We did not take a view that on whether it was a good or bad thing to eat animals generally. Indeed, we took it as something that would be quite inappropriate for us to take a view as a starting point, because we wanted to start where we were and see what direction we should be heading in. But I think the issues, in a sense, are different just because we have just different intuitions about what might be acceptable. And I think the starting point with farmed animals is a little different. But here, I think I'll pass back to Liz on that one. Maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Well, I think you're absolutely right in that this is outwith the scope of the report. So it didn't focus on companion animals. I mean, speaking as a philosopher, a moral philosopher who looks in this area, I think your question does point to a very problematic discrepancy between the way that different animals are treated. I think that there are a lot of examples of that, and I think to be honest, that's probably less a question for me or John and more a question for politicians to answer. But you're right. I mean, the more we find out about the complexity and sophistication of animals, the more generally that sort of pushes us to question the different ways in which we treat different animals, and the way in which we tend to think that say pets are entitled to special consideration because of their relationship with us. But as I say, that is outwith report. That was me talking as a moral philosopher, not speaking for the report.
Thank you. I mean, I don't want to talk about the relationship with humans. When John talked about the red light regarding chickens' beak, which I find absolutely bad. So why do we not have a system where we try to make the same welfare consideration? It's not about something else, about the animal welfare, so that the chickens are not mutilated in this way, because what we consider, for other animals to be unacceptable. That for me, it's really a big problem. For those traffic lights, red signs, that at least we try to have a consistent legislation, because that shows a double morale, and that is really bad ethically.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your question, Theodora. Stephen has just briefly stepped aside, so I shall chair briefly until he returns. Can we have our next question? And it's from Marcus Bates. Marcus, could you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you very much. I was really struck by this idea that we would use gene-edited animals in order to cram more pigs into a pen. This public perception. My question was, as stocking densities in pig production are highly regulated, the ability of pig producers to increase these through using GE animals is equally highly regulated. So is this concern that I've learned about tonight from the public, is that just something that we need to focus on with better communication?
Thank you. Who wants to take this first? I'm looking at all three of us.
I'll get on. I'll give her an initial stab. So I think one of the issues was, yes, you're right, there was a sense of a kind of a race to the bottom. And in that context, better communication is undoubtedly very helpful. I don't think just about that in general. I think people felt very divorced from food and how it's made, and actually beginning to get people to engage more meaningfully with some of the issues involved in rearing meat would be a great thing to do. I think the broader point I was trying to make is more about it doesn't legitimate the technology if it's just continuing the status quo. And that's what people felt quite disempowered currently to really think about how you change a food and farming system. And obviously you can make an argument they could change their diet, but it felt a bit like shouting into the void a bit. So that was the primary concern. It's that I know this isn't quite right, and I'd like to exercise some agency here, but I don't know how to do it. And in that context, what the boundaries were around that technology and the extent to which it should even improve rather than just maintain current welfare standards was critical. But despite all that, absolutely, yes. I mean, if things are based on a misunderstanding, then better communication is paramount. But we shouldn't just think that by communicating to someone, they're going to necessarily see the world through our eyes.
Thank you very much. Elizabeth or John, do you want to add anything?
Well, I just certainly say the example was very hypothetical. I certainly didn't want to insinuate anything bad about pig farmers particularly. But I guess the point, and I think Darren has brought this out, is that we're not assuming that if the way things are currently done is necessarily a benchmark for being what we would consider acceptable. So the high stocking densities that are allowed, or arguably high, at least with something that need to be looked at, and the extent to which the diseases that we were trying to present were consequences of what we thought were unacceptable husbandry practices would at least need to be asked. And I guess it maybe a better example might possibly have been, though a gene isn't known, the question of tails in pigs, which are an interesting case because there is, in fact, as I'm sure our questioner knows, legislation that requires attempts being made to prevent pigs from being stocked in ways that lead to them needing to have their tails removed to avoid them harming one another. In fact, a large majority of pigs do nevertheless have their tails removed. And no doubt this would be a very interesting question if we were able to find a genetic modification that would produce pigs without tails.
Well, we could go on to a discussion about what tails are for on pigs, but
Indeed.
We've got other people who've got questions they want to put. Yeah. Can I invite the next questioner, John Lowe, to put his question? John, if you can unmute yourself and put your question.
Yes, I was very pleased to see that Stephen Metcalf raised the question of the international impact of the work that you do, but I think he has exposed a real need that what you do, and I recognize that there are parallels in some other countries, should have international direction. If we don't do that, recognizing the high proportion of particularly animal products that come in from other parts of the world, you're really wasting your time, aren't you? Sorry if that sounds cruel.
Well, who wants to take that question first? John?
I probably should take this, though it would be probably better still if we had some Nuffield, full-time Nuffield person here. But I do know this much. I mean, the Nuffield Council makes great efforts to communicate with similar bodies in other parts of the world. It meets regularly with a German and a French counterpart, and I know that recently senior members of the Nuffield Council were meeting with high-level people in China are concerned with these things. They could no doubt tell you much more about the details. But certainly, I believe it's also undoubtedly true that the Nuffield reports have a lot of international weight and influence. Obviously, it's difficult for a British body to tell other countries' legislatures what we think they should legislate, but essentially there is a great deal of contact, and it is an institution that has quite a lot of international status.
I accept that, but thinking of other tools, would it help if the UK government's regulations place some sort of barriers or inhibitors to those countries' products which are, let's just say, don't satisfy the high standards that we have in this country? That's the sort of thing that I feel that the EU was trying to do before we left it.
I think I maybe suggested in my first answer to this that I take it that would, but again, this maybe is more of a question for many other people here than for the members of this group. But certainly it makes a lot of sense that in an international market, one needs to, well, it's not going to be very effective to make these sorts of requirements without having some some regulations on what one's going to eat from other countries.
Right, well, I'm going to steer our discussion back to the next questioner and then hand over to Stephen to chair the rest of it. But it's a particular pleasure to invite Alessandro Coatti to take part because he's a former colleague of mine. So, Ale, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to all the panelists and speakers. And I have many questions. I started off with this one, but which was about potentially information sharing for consumers and the kind of labeling that your report suggests might be beneficial or kind of more morally right or acceptable in terms of, should it focus on the standards of breeding and the type of outcomes that the breeding tries to achieve, and also including the welfare of animals, instead of labeling a product as something that has been that has used genome editing in the making of it. If that makes sense.
Right. There we are, Stephen. Are you back? Well, I'm handing, if you can hear me, Stephen, I'm handing over to you for you to take that question about information sharing for consumers and
who would like to have a crack at
the welfare of animals?
Who would like to have a crack at answering that?
I mean, I can talk about it in the context of the dialogue. I mean, we didn't get down to that level of discussion. I know that there's potentially some further work going to be done in this area by BBSRC and others. And
oh, Darren has frozen by the look of it. Anyone else?
Well, I guess just while Darren unfreezes, I imagine he was alluding to the fact that it is hoped that there will be a much more extensive public consultation on this whole topic, specifically funded by, among others, BBSRC, as he mentioned. We do talk a little bit about labeling in the report and the desirability of having as much access information, as much information as possible available to consumers on the provenance and history of food that they're eating. It's not a major topic, but it's certainly something we allude to as significant. And Liz, do you have anything to add on that but maybe not.
No, I mean, I think you've covered it. I mean, we do briefly talk about labeling and the need to make sure that there is accurate advice for consumers. But as the questioner suggested, that's about a wide range of things. So breeding practices and technologies would be part of it, but also factors for safety, nutrition, sustainability, animal welfare. They're all important considerations for keeping consumers informed.
Of course, it's not the technology we were mainly addressing, but of course there does now exist technology where one could easily put a barcode or something on a label that would make much more information available than one's going to actually print in letters on a label. But.
Right. Well, now I think Stephen has left us again briefly. And while you were giving your answers, I apologize, but I was voting. You can now vote by phone temporarily to avoid people going through the division lobbies together. So I've just had a vote on a pension provision of a bill, and I'm now fully back at your command, ready for the next question. If Lee could kindly tell us from whom it may come.
Yes, Stephen, it's from Dr. William Duncan.
William, a pleasure to see you, if we can see you, but let's at least hear you.
I hope you can hear me clearly.
Well, I heard that, yes.
Yes. Well, first of all, thanks to the presenters for such a clear presentation. My comment is that really public acceptance of all of this new technology will depend on creating win-win outcomes, that is good for both humans and animals, rather than creating either win-lose or worse, lose-lose outcomes. So my question is, how optimistic are you that we will achieve win-win outcomes? And what would you see as the key things necessary to try and achieve that? Thank you.
So I'm happy to start, but I think actually Darren would probably be the person who had most to say. I mean, there are win-wins here, clearly. I mean, so there are potential wins if we think about the potential changes that we're talking about that are needed for the food and farming industry. There are win-wins in terms of human health and shifting diets generally, but there are also big win-wins potentially for animal welfare. So we talked focusing on this technology in particular. We talked about the potential for disease resistance, which could be good for animal welfare and could reduce the need for antibiotics, which would have positive impacts for humans. So the key is to make sure that these win-wins are, as you so eloquently put it, introduced in a way that doesn't mean losing in another way or shifting to a less, maintaining a less sustainable or less just way of doing things. So there are win-wins here, absolutely. But I think it is a part of this is going to be public dialogue about how the public will feel about them and how the public will accept them, what the public will regard as acceptable. So I'll hand that over to Darren.
Thank you, Darren.
So I've been having a battle with Virgin Media, which I've just lost and had to come back in. So I unfortunately missed the question. Sorry, my broadband went down. So I missed the question. Could you repeat it to me? Apologies.
William, would you repeat the question for Darren?
Thank you. I've unmuted myself again. It was about how to achieve win-win outcomes or perceptions of win-win outcomes, because public acceptance on any new technology will be about how they see it as benefit to all. And clearly there is a tension that might exist here between benefits to humans and benefits to animals. But as been very eloquently described, this really does have the potential for both. So my question was about how optimistic can we be that we will achieve win-win, and what would be the key measures to do so? Thank you.
I think we can be optimistic if we put the structures and effort and desire in place to create those conversations. I mean, I guess my big learning from doing this, and not just this, all dialogues I've ran, is if you create the right space, people can engage on all sorts of weird and wonderful topic. So never underestimate the public. I think the other thing is just about, we need that vision about what we want to create from food and farming. And in that context, understand the role of not just genome editing, but a whole host of technologies and other ways of getting there that work strategically together. I think if that's done, then that's a great outcome, and something that publics and others can play a full and meaningful role in.
Thank you very much for that. Can I just follow up myself with one quick question? I think it was you, Darren, who said earlier that people were not that familiar with farming practices. Is it that modern society has just got out of touch with how food is actually produced, and therefore when you hold these sessions to explore the idea of a well-lived animal life and so on, it takes people by surprise to discover that often they're treated badly?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can overegg that. People do know, yeah. I mean, it's not they've got some romantic notion of, I don't know, on McDonald's farm or something. They're disengaged. So we got people to take an item of food out of their fridge and talk about it, where it came from, how it was prepared. And it was really revealing about how, that they know the wool's being pulled over their eyes. They still like the bacon or the sausage or whatever it is. And so they, in that sense, they're kind of complicit in not asking the question, so they don't have to hear the answer. That I think there is a genuine opportunity for people to be, to engage with that better, about the consequences of choices, and how we create a better system. But yes, I mean, people don't feel that plugged in and realize, both through how it's presented in supermarkets and how people in marketing market stuff, that there's a disconnect between that and real practice. But I think we'd welcome the opportunity to actually see what goes on behind the curtain.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Now, just a second, I gathered that there are no more questions at the moment. Therefore, if that is the case, can I invite each of you just to give yourselves a couple of minutes to highlight the key points you'd like the watching audience to take away with you. I declare an interest in this because I've told you earlier, it's freezing cold here. Therefore, from my point of view, if we bring this to a close slightly earlier, it'll help me to warm up. But genuinely, if we can go with John first, and Elizabeth and Darren, would you like to make a few key summary points? John.
Sure. Yeah, thank you very much. I just to come back to this question about the win-win, and really just reiterate essentially what Darren was saying, because I think this is crucial. I think that the real win-win here is to recognize that this is an opportunity to really take a very good look at what our food and farming systems involve, and what we want from them, and what it would be to have morally acceptable, sustainable, functional food and farming systems that really serve everybody's interests and provide us with what we need from them. And the fact that we have these growing powers to shape farming systems the way we want is an opportunity to look at this and really get a win, which also is a win that absolutely focuses on, in a way we haven't certainly for a long time, on the interests of the animals to the appropriate extent at any rate, as well as the interests of us as consumers of the farmed animals.
Thank you. Elizabeth.
Well, I think John's given a completely brilliant summary there. So, I mean, I think to reiterate my main point, I mean, this is a system which does need to adapt. The food and farming system will need to change to become both just and sustainable. That's not going to come as news to anybody listening to me. So we do face this major challenge. We have an industry which is at once absolutely necessary, fundamental to securing basic justice, and is facing all these global challenges, and in many ways exacerbating these global challenges, which undermine basic justice. So we have a system which needs to adapt and to change, and we need governments to take a leadership role on that and to engage in public dialogue about what is the best way forward. And we have, bringing into this mix, this potentially transformative technology, and so what we are saying, and what we've come to the conclusion, I think, is that this is a moment to sort of think about the checks and controls that we want on our how our food is produced and the way that it can be done most responsibly, and that one of the things that's going to have to involve is making sure that this potential tool for good really does become that, rather than a way of potentially entrenching unsustainable systems.
Thank you very much indeed. Darren, would you like to have your last summary points?
I don't have a huge amount to add, I think. I applaud both what John and Elizabeth have mentioned. I think just to say, publics aren't anti-technology. What they are anti is bad decisions. So I think there is a wonderful opportunity post-Brexit, with where the technologies are and so on, for the UK to show some leadership in this space, and not just to focus on kind of downstream regulation to mitigate technical risks, but about a positive vision of farming into which this technology could play a role. And if it does that, then I'm sure the public will be very supportive, actually.
Right. Well, look, thank you very, very much indeed, all three speakers, John Dupre, Elizabeth Cripps, and Darren Bhattacharya. I'd like to thank you for your excellent contributions. And can I also thank Richella Logan, who's the head of public affairs at the Nuffield, who some of us saw earlier, but has disappeared from our screens at the moment. And, you know, the Nuffield Bioethics Centre has had this wonderful reputation for 30 years. And you've given us a very good opportunity to think about things which we're going to be discussing for years to come. And it may well be that we return to this subject as we get closer to the point at which maybe some future government decides to take more specific action in this area. So I'd like to thank you all very much for coming. I'd also like to thank, if it's all right, our normal Parliamentary and Scientific Committee team of John Slater, Karen Smith, Ben Allen, Alfie Hoare, Lee Jeffs, and there will be a report written up for discussion later on our website. I think I'm right in saying, Lee Jeffs will correct me if I'm wrong, that your report is still under embargo, is that correct? In which case everyone has got to bear in mind that for the time being, but it's very timely to have it discussed tonight.
Sorry, Stephen, just say that that's until December the 1st, I understand.
Okay, well, December the 1st is getting closer, but if you can hold on till then, everybody, you don't want to ruin anybody's embargo. Now, I will end now by inviting you to our next discussion, which is on Monday, the 17th of January at 5:30, in partnership with the Physiological Society. And although it seems a bit strange to do so on the 29th of November, I suppose it falls to me on behalf of Stephen Metcalfe and everyone else in the Parliamentary and Scientific Committee team to wish you a very happy Christmas and New Year. It's the first time I've used those words this year. It still feels a little bit premature. Better to wait really and embargo myself until the 1st of December. But nevertheless, I do hope you do have a wonderful, relaxing December, considering everything that's going on. I'd like to wish Elizabeth a good, safe trip home, because you told me you were going to encounter the cold conditions of Edinburgh while I encounter these. And as a matter of fact, a tour group has now arrived in the Royal Gallery, so I think I'd better bring this to a close, but say goodbye to everybody. Thank you for joining us. And it's been really interesting. And I would predict that we're going to return to this over the next 5 years without a doubt. So thank you again very much indeed, and goodbye for now.